I'm Stephen Kinzer, author of The True Flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the Birth of American Empire. 1898 was definitely the year when the United States changed more than any other year in our history. When that year began, America was fairly quiet and fairly satisfied within its borders. By the time that year ended, we were taking islands all over the world, and the country was caught up in a huge debate over whether this was a good idea or not. How did we get to that point? Cuban revolutionaries were at that moment fighting to overthrow Spanish colonialism. That war had been going on for several years, and Americans hadn't paid too much attention to it. But in the spring of 1898, the great newspaper tycoon William Randolph Hearst began to cast his eye on this war as a way that he might increase the circulation of his newspapers. Hearst was the founder of what was then called yellow journalism. We now call it fake news. And he was a master at fake news. He decided very consciously that he needed a running story to keep people buying newspapers every day. War is the best running story of all. Hearst set out quite consciously to push the U.S. into war in Cuba. He knew that once American soldiers were fighting anywhere, Americans would be fascinated and want to read about what was happening. So he began running stories about the brutal oppression that Spain was visiting on the poor, victimized Cubans. It later turned out that many of these very poignant articles, accompanied by graphic illustrations in his New York Journal, were actually written by reporters who had never even been in Cuba. But Hearst realized something that was true then and is still true today about Americans. We're very compassionate people. We hate the idea that anybody's suffering anywhere. And if you want to get us into a war, just show us that some people are being brutalized and we'll jump in. And that's exactly what happened. The United States became quite outraged. The press played up the terrors in Cuba. We sent troops to Cuba. But then our military commanders realized that if we were at war with Spain, the Spanish naval fleet might retaliate by attacking the U.S. mainland. To prevent that, we had to find the Spanish fleet and sink it. We had some trouble finding it. It wasn't in Cuba. It wasn't in Spain. It was in a place that no American had ever heard of, the Philippine Islands, which had been a colony of Spain for centuries. So, partly motivated by Teddy Roosevelt, who was then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, we did send a squadron to the Philippines, and we sank the Spanish fleet. And then suddenly we had to confront something we'd never imagined or thought through. So Spain had ruled the Philippines for so long, now the Spanish fleet is at the bottom of the sea. So what happens to the Philippines? Do we allow them to become independent? Or do we take them? Also, Puerto Rico suddenly is available, and Guam, Cuba, all these Spanish islands are available. This focused American attention on something we had never thought of before. We had always been told as Americans that it was our manifest destiny to fill up North America. But by the end of the 19th century, we'd filled up North America. Then we had to make this huge choice. Do we now build up our country and focus inward? But we've been expanding essentially ever since the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, so maybe we should keep expanding beyond North America. That was the beginning of the great debate that's at the center of my book.